Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is the third and I hope final video that I'm going to be recording for you guys, unless something comes up here in the next couple weeks before we all actually get back to work for real. This video is going to cover the SES grading policy. It's important that you know we do have a policy. We expect the teachers to follow it. It deals with things like how to weight your grades, how to handle late work, how to handle missing work, extra credit, and so on and so forth. And so please make sure that as you're moving through the school year, you're referring back to the grading policy and you're making your grading decisions based on what we have documented here. This grading policy, it is written down. It's actually part of the parent-student handbook, which we dealt with in the last video. But it's important enough, I decided to pull it out as a separate video. You can find this policy in the back of the handbook. It's actually an appendix. It's appendix number 2. And if you want to go there and look at that and read along while I'm talking through this, please feel free to do so. I'm actually going to skip the first page of the grading policy. I don't think there's too much that's difficult to understand there, and we'll talk about homework when we get to the back to school week. I'm going to instead start on page number 2, about 2/3 of the way down. Excuse me. We have a section there called SES, 1st through 12th grades. And what this section deals with is how you are to set up and weight the categories within your grade book. We do expect to see 2 main categories in everybody's grade book, one for formative assessments and one for summative assessments, right? That summative assessment category should count for a minimum of 65% of your classes or your courses grade weighting, right? So tests and quizzes, summative assessments are 65% of your overall grade at a minimum. If you want your tests to count more than that, you can go higher. You can make them count 70, 75, 80% if you desire, but you should never go below 65% in your weighting system, right? And then likewise, the formative assessments, your classwork and homework, those are to count a maximum of 35%. You can have them count less if you want to. If you want your homework and classwork to only count 30 or 25% of your course grade, that's fine, but never more than 35%, right? And what we're trying to do here with these percentages is combat grade inflation and to make sure that grades are an accurate reflection of learning. I've certainly encountered at different times where I've looked at a student or two's grades, and I can see that their tests and quizzes are very low C's, maybe even a D in there, but they have a B in the course, right? They're coming to me saying, hey, I want to be in the advanced class. I'm getting B's, looking at their tests, like I said, low C's and D's. Why do they have a B? And digging into that, you find out that the reason is because classwork has been given an exorbitant weighting, right? And so they're compliant with doing their classwork, and so that work grade is pretty good and pretty high, but they're clearly not learning when you look at those low test grades. And so their overall grade for the class isn't really reflective of their learning. And so that's just one example of what we are trying to combat there by having these grade weights in place. Okay. The next thing I'll talk about here in the grading policy is right below that, and it deals with the retake of tests. We do allow teachers to give students the opportunity to retake their tests. The spirit of this part of the policy is that we want to encourage learning, right? That's what we're here for as educators, is to help our students learn. And sometimes it may take more than one stab at a test for that learning to occur. A common example is, right, you can take the driver's test 2 or 3 times, and all that matters is you pass it the last time that you finally show that you can learn. And so it's in that spirit we have test retakes. However, through the years, we've learned that these test retake policies can create a lot of excessive work on the part of the teachers. It feels like their class is never moving forward because there's so many kids that are still trying to retake stuff from the past. And so we've really tried to craft this policy. I think we've got it in a pretty good place where there's a good balance between offering students grace and the opportunity to have another attempt at learning while not burdening the teacher with an excessive amount of work created by students who are just, trying to grab at a couple extra points in order to bolster their grades. So let's dig into that. The first detail here with test retakes lets you know that if a student scores less than a 70% on a test, so that means they get a D or an F. If a student gets a D or an F on a test, you are obligated as a teacher to allow them the opportunity to do a retake on the test, right? But the wording here is very specific. You have to give them the opportunity, right? It's up to the student to approach you and to request the retake of the test. It's not your job to hunt them down or to schedule a time and make them retake the test, right? They have to initiate that on their own. But if they do come to you, right, and say, look, I got a D on the test, I'd like to retake it, you're obligated to allow them the opportunity to do that. Once we're past that point, then we talk about, well, what do you need to do in order to qualify beyond that for retaking the test? Your next step should be to look at the grade book. If that student is missing classwork or homework assignments from that unit, that should be priority number one. They need to go back and complete the missing assignments before they're allowed to retake the test. Presumably, that's probably why they didn't do too well on the test in the first place, is because they were missing some of the work building up to the test. And then the next thing the student needs to do in order to qualify for that retake is they need to work with you to put together some kind of plan for what their relearning efforts are going to be. Do they need to reread the chapter? Are they going to commit to restudying? Are they going to make an outline summary? Like, what is the activity they're going to engage in, to improve their learning above what they did the first time through before retaking the test, right? We don't want to just see students take the test on Monday, get it handed back on Tuesday with a bad grade, retake it on Wednesday with very little effort to restudy or relearn the material, right? And so there should be work to that end. Next point to make on retaking tests, students need to complete that test retake within 2 weeks of the original date of the test, right? And that's just to keep them in the class and even you moving forward in a productive fashion. Presumably the new chapter you're working on now builds on the chapter you just finished, right? So spending a long time relearning that material is actually hurting the student, right? They need to have a good grasp of that information so they continue to do well on the new stuff that you're presenting to them, right? And I think this policy also prevents scenarios where students come to you in a big crush at the end of the quarter. I've got an 89. Can I retake the chapter 1 test that was 6 weeks ago, and maybe I can get a 90, right? That's not what test retakes are designed to do, right? We want them to be timely and in close proximity to when that learning and instruction was given, okay? Last detail, I think it's important that this is in there as well. There have been times when we've encountered students who've tried to use this test retake policy to their advantage, to use it as a loophole to get extra study time. The most direct example of that would be a student comes to school on Tuesday. They bomb the test on purpose because they didn't have time to study. And now they've just bought for themselves an extra 2 weeks of study time, right? Through varying means, a lot of times the teacher learns about that. Sometimes the student will even just come up to you. I'm going to fail it anyway, so I'm just going to do the retake. Amazing how many times students will just tell you that kind of stuff to your face. In those situations, when you have clear evidence that a student hasn't made a good faith effort on the original exam, you are not required to give them a test retake. I would encourage you at that point to come talk to me or whoever your administrator is, just to make sure that we're confident that this is a good scenario where it's clear that the student has bombed a test on purpose to gain an advantage in doing a test retake, right? But if that's the case, if that's what we know is going on there, right, we don't want to create a situation where students are able to use this policy against us, right? It was put there with good intentions and not to create these kinds of loopholes for students to perhaps slacken work and then use it to their advantage. Anyways, moving on from that, the next section in the grading policy deals with due dates. We do, of course, want students to turn their work in on time. That's the preferable thing to see in every circumstance. And at the same time, we understand that sometimes things just come up in a student's life. They were really busy one night, or something happened at home, an emergency, and homework couldn't get done that night, and so it's turned in a day late, right? Again, our goal is to encourage learning. We don't want students to feel like, well, I missed the assignment, so it's just a zero. Presumably you gave it to them because there was some value to it. And so a little bit of grace in due dates can be appropriate, as long as we're not excessive with that grace. And so there are some consequences if students turn in late work. So let's go ahead and talk through how this policy works. The first thing you should know is that when you encounter a missing assignment, what we want you to do is to put an M in for the student's grade, an M for missing. Don't put a zero, put the letter M. Now, this might be a scenario where a student's been absent this week. They're home with the flu. You've been assigning classwork and homework, and they haven't even been there to get it. So they're not turning it in. They're legitimately sick and absent, but the work is still missing. We would still ask that you put an M for missing in the grade book. And what that does is it communicates to the parent and the student when they log into their portals, their grade portals on their end. They'll see the assignment there, and it will notate M missing, right? Whereas if you just put a zero, it becomes unclear. Like, did I fail it? Did I get all the questions wrong? What's the zero about, right? Now, where some angst gets created in using this missing code is the gradebook does count it as a zero. So we go back to that scenario where a student's been sick with the flu and they haven't turned in their classwork. You put in an M for missing, and you watch their 85 drop to a 79, right? This B student just became a C because they're out sick this week, right? And that can feel unfairly punitive for a student that's sick. I think there's a couple things you need to be ready to communicate in those situations. First of all, I know you're sick, and when you turn it in, you're allowed to turn it in for full credit, right? You're not going to have a grade penalty for this. This is just a temporary placeholder to let you know that you haven't turned in this work, it's missing, and you need to get it turned in. I think the other thing that's important to realize is a lot of times that reduction in grade, it serves as a great motivator for students to get things turned in, right? They log into their grade book and they see a C. Oh my, what happened? I had a B just the other day, and oh, this is missing. I need to get that turned in, right? It motivates in that way. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen where teachers have left grades blank or something like that. And then time went on and the student didn't realize they hadn't turned something in. Then you hit the end of the quarter and you put it in as a zero, and they're like, oh, I had no idea, right? So please use that missing code whenever work is late or missing, regardless of the reason, if it's an excused or unexcused absence or whatnot. Please use that as a best method of communication. Okay. Now, if you have students who are just turning things in late, because they didn't do the work when they should have, you are allowed to assess grade penalties for missing work or work that's been turned in late, up to 50% off. So you can give as much as half credit for missing work. We've left that a little bit open so that teachers can have some flexibility in what they want to do. Some teachers just do a 10-point reduction every time for every day that an assignment is late. Other teachers take 10% off whatever the grade is the student has earned, or different methods like that. But at the end of the day, you can take no more than half credit off for any missing assignment. That would be half credit of what was earned, right? So if a student turns in a paper 3 days late, they get an 80 on it, you could count that as a 40% in the grade book. Okay. The other thing to notate there is they do have a 3-day limit to turn in late work. After 3 days, you can then count a missing assignment as a 0 and have that be a permanent 0. But a 3-day limit to turn in any late or missing work. Okay. Next item in the grading policy deals with extra credit. We talked a little bit earlier here in the video about trying to combat grade inflation, and that's what the extra credit policy is designed to do here as well. We don't really look too favorably on giving extra credit in courses here at Sarasota Christian School. And the kind of extra credit I'm talking about are like extra credit assignments. These are the assignments where, perhaps a student comes to you at the end of the quarter, Mr. Martell, I've got an 89. I really want to have an A in your class. Is there some kind of extra credit I can do to bring my grade up, right? And they're basically asking you to gin up some kind of assignment that will boost their grade. And it's not based on their tests, their quizzes, their homework. It's just, some arbitrary assignment being created really for no purpose other than bringing their grade up. Like, that's the kind of extra credit we're not really interested in doing here at Sarasota Christian School. Very different from extra credit questions on a test, okay? You are allowed to give 2 or 3 questions on the end of a test for some extra credit points on that test, just not extra credit assignments. Another example of extra credit assignments that I've seen, sometimes teachers with very good intentions, in order to encourage students to attend an event. The drama department's putting on a play. There's some kind of festival where we need volunteers, and a teacher will say, look, I will give you, this many extra credit points on your grade if you go to that thing, if you attend that event, right? That's not related to the learning in your course, right? It's just inappropriate credit being given. Appreciate the heart behind it that says we're trying to support the school and things that the school is trying to do, but we want our grades to have integrity and to represent the learning in the course, right? I want to go back real quickly to talk about extra credit that might be given on a test, right? Since that kind of extra credit is allowed, we do have some limits I'd like to see there as well. Extra credit when given on a test should be limited to no more than 5 points on a 100-point scale, right? Or, half a letter grade. Again, things that I've certainly seen or encountered would be situations where a teacher's given extra credit and it's worth 10 points, right? A 10-point value on extra credit automatically means, regardless of what their score was, they're going to have a full letter grade higher just by doing that extra credit on the test. That's pretty significant inflation of a grade. It's one thing to have 5 points of extra credit, right? A student gets an 82, ends up with an 87. Their B stays a B, but it's a higher B, right? Or a kid who's right on the cusp, they had an 88, you give them that 5 points of extra credit, and now they've got a 92, right? But they were on the cusp, and they didn't end up with a high A, they ended up with a low A, right? So we just want to make sure that the extra credit is not so grandiose that it's creating an inflation of their test grade. So if you do give extra credit on a test, limit it to 5 points on a 100-point scale, or half a letter grade worth of credit. Last part of the policy deals with academic dishonesty, right? Unfortunately, this does happen from time to time. And so we do have a policy in place on how you are expected to deal with that. With a first offense, we try to offer some grace. It's not that there aren't consequences, but kids make mistakes. They're middle school students. They're still pretty young. And so we want to give them an opportunity to learn from their mistake before we get really punitive. So on a first offense, their grade should not be impacted unless they fail to redo the assignment. So the consequence for cheating is that they do have to redo the assignment. Um, Without the cheat, without the help, whatever it is that they did, they need to independently redo that assignment on their own. And if they redo that assignment, you would give them full credit based upon their second attempt on the assignment. If they choose to not redo the assignment on that first offense, then you would be validated in putting in a 0, right? You offered them the opportunity to redo it. They chose not to, and so they opted to take that 0, right? Now, when we come to subsequent offenses of cheating, second and thirds, right, the policy shifts, right? No longer are we in, hey, go ahead and redo it and you can get full credit. Now we're going to start taking points off or having some kind of disciplinary measure put in place for repeated incidents of cheating. So a second offense of cheating may be as drastic as going to an automatic 0. It could be half credit and redo the assignment, but there would start to be some kind of grade penalty in place for repeated offenses. And like I said, perhaps even disciplinary measures, depending upon the severity of the cheating, right? It's always tough talking about these things. It's a big difference between, I had somebody else write my essay for me versus, I looked over and got the answer to question number 2 on my test, right? Some cheating is just far more egregious than others. And so the consequences might vary based upon the nature of the cheating. And then last thing to mention, this really deals more with high school courses, but just so that you're aware of it. There's a lot of grace and a lot of flexibility built into this policy. Attempts to redo tests, attempts to redo assignments, extra credit, and so forth. That when you get to the more advanced courses in high school, honors courses, AP courses, dual enrollment courses, starts to feel like an inaccurate representation of the way college coursework would be graded in the real world. And so because of that, we do say that these grading policies don't necessarily need to be followed if you're teaching an honors course, an AP, or a dual enrollment course, right? We want to hold those courses to a higher standard. We want them to be graded with the same kind of rigor that they would be if they were, college courses at a college. And so we exempt a lot of those classes from our grading policy. Okay. And maybe just one other thing that might be worth me pointing out. I won't talk about it here in this video, but artificial intelligence in the last 2 years has become like a big thing. We do have a policy related to that in the parent-student handbook as well. It's appendix number 3, so it comes right after the grade book. I think you'd be wise to take a look at that and just be familiar with how we deal with AI in coursework here at Sarasota Christian School. All right, thanks for your time to listen to these videos. I hope they've been informative. Again, if you have questions, please write those down and come prepared to ask them when we get back to work. Hope to see you guys soon.